I spent the entire afternoon choosing a dress, carefully smoothing down the fabric as if this dinner might finally bridge the distance that had grown between my son and me. My heart was hopeful, even trembling a little, because tonight I believed I could sit across from him, share a meal, and feel like family again. Before we go deeper into this story of family, betrayal, and unexpected dignity, make sure you hit subscribe right now, because every week I share real stories like this one that remind us how easily respect can be taken for granted, and how powerful it feels to reclaim it. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. This is just the start of our journey together. Then the phone rang. My son's voice was clipped, his words sharper than any knife in my kitchen. "Don't come," he said. "You embarrass my wife." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The hope I had stitched into every button of that dress collapsed around me. I stood frozen in silence, staring at the table I had set with quiet care, realizing this night was about to change everything. So, let's get into what happened after that phone call, because the words didn't just land on me like a passing comment. They stayed lodged in my chest, heavy and unshakable. I remember sitting on the edge of my chair, still holding the phone long after the line had gone quiet, staring at the empty dining table I had set for myself earlier. The napkin was folded neatly, the glass shined in the kitchen light, and yet all of it looked foolish now, like a stage set for a scene that had been canceled without warning. I tried to swallow, but the bitterness made it difficult. My son had always been direct, but never cruel. Those words, telling me that I embarrassed his wife, repeated in my head again and again. Embarrassed. That word of all words. After everything I had done for him, after the years I gave to make sure he never went without, to be reduced to an inconvenience was something I had not prepared myself for. I stood and began to move around the kitchen, picking up the plate, then setting it down again. I didn't know what to do with my hands. It's strange how quickly a house can shift in feeling. Just an hour earlier, I was humming softly as I ironed my blouse, excited to be included in something as simple as dinner with family. Now, the walls felt closer, the silence almost pressing down on me. I sat back and tried to figure it out. Was it me? Was it the way I talked too much about the past, or how I still carried an old purse instead of something stylish? Was it the way I prepared food that seemed outdated to them? My daughter-in-law had never hidden her disapproval of my habits, but I had always believed that love would make room for differences. My son's words proved me wrong. Memories flooded me uninvited. Him as a child, pulling at my sleeve when he was nervous on his first day of school. Me, standing in line for hours to make sure he got into the music program he wanted. The countless nights when I came home tired but still cooked him a warm meal because I didn't want him to feel forgotten. None of those moments mattered now. None of that history shielded me from being discarded in a single sentence. I looked at the clock and thought about where they might be now. Were they already seated at the restaurant, smiling and ordering without a thought about me sitting here alone? I imagined my daughter-in-law laughing, perfectly comfortable now that I wasn't around. My son would sit quietly, maybe even relieved. That thought cut deeper than I expected. The idea that my own child could feel relieved without me there made my chest tighten in a way I can't fully describe. I stood again, restless. The window above the sink showed the street outside, calm and steady as if nothing had shifted in the world. Cars passed, a couple walked their dog, everything normal. And yet inside my house, nothing felt normal anymore. I had raised a son who could tell his mother not to come because she embarrassed his wife. That reality was something I had never prepared myself for. I went into my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. My dress, the one I had ironed so carefully, now hung loosely on me as though mocking the effort. I thought about changing, about putting it back in the closet, but instead I stayed there staring at the floor. 1,000 questions filled my mind, none with answers that made sense. How long had my daughter-in-law felt this way? Why had my son allowed her opinion to outweigh his own bond with me? Did he even see me as the woman who raised him anymore, or just as a burden who didn't fit the image of the life he wanted? I tried to remember the last time I had felt truly welcome in their home. It wasn't Christmas, because that had been tense. It wasn't his birthday, because I had been told not to bring food that year. I thought harder and realized it had been years since I had been embraced without conditions, without a hint of judgment. The realization stung. After some time, I walked back to the kitchen and sat again at the empty table. The glass I had polished so carefully still gleamed in the light. My reflection in it looked unfamiliar, tired, older than I felt inside. I touched the rim, then pulled my hand back as if it burned. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone in a room. It comes from knowing you are unwanted in the very places you once belonged. That's what I felt that night. Not simply loneliness, but erasure. As though my years of effort, my sacrifices, my history, had been neatly swept aside so they could live a life polished and free of me. I sat there until the food on the stove cooled, untouched. I couldn't bring myself to eat. My stomach felt hollow, but it wasn't hunger. It was the ache of being rejected by the person I had given everything to. Eventually, I stood, turned off the lights, and left the table exactly as it was, a reminder of the evening that should have been. I went to bed without undressing, still in the dress I had ironed, and stared at the ceiling until sleep finally came. That night, my son's words kept circling in my head, looping over and over until they no longer sounded real, but more like a chant I couldn't escape. Embarrassed his wife. Embarrassed. Me, the woman who had built him up, who had protected him from hunger and fear. And now, I was the one he wanted hidden. I didn't know it then, but this was only the beginning. The night after the phone call, I couldn't rest. Every time I closed my eyes, the silence of the house grew louder and memories started surfacing on their own. To understand why those words hurt as deeply as they did, I have to take you back to where my love for food and my stubborn streak to build something of my own began. I grew up in a home that had very little money, but a lot of activity around the kitchen table. My mother was a quiet woman, not one to hand out compliments, but she made sure that no matter what, there was food on the stove. She taught me early on how to stretch ingredients, how to use one chicken for 3 meals, how to turn scraps into soup. I didn't realize it back then, but those evenings beside her watching her cut vegetables were laying the foundation for everything I would one day do. When I was in high school, I started experimenting myself. I'd come home from classes and try to recreate recipes I had seen in magazines. Sometimes they failed, sometimes they worked, but I noticed something important. When the food turned out well, even my tired father smiled a little more, and my brothers stopped arguing for a few minutes. Food had a way of calming storms, even if only briefly. That feeling stayed with me. Of course, nobody thought of cooking as a career. For girls like me, the expectation was simple: finish school, get married, raise children, maybe take an office job if times were hard. When I once mentioned to a teacher that I wanted to own a cafe someday, she gave me a look that hovered between disbelief and pity. "That's nice," she said, "but maybe aim for something realistic." Those words stuck, though I didn't let them kill the idea. Years later, when I married, my husband didn't encourage the dream either. He was practical, always worried about money, and he thought opening a restaurant was a foolish gamble. He'd say things like, "People can cook at home. Why would they pay you?" I didn't argue much, not then, because we had bills to pay and a son to raise. But I carried that little ember inside, quietly waiting for its chance. When my son was young, I started taking small catering jobs. It wasn't much at first, making trays of food for neighbors' parties, helping with church events, sometimes baking pies for the local market. I'd wake before dawn to get it done, then still make breakfast for my family before they left for the day. Those mornings were exhausting, but they were also the first time I felt like I was carving out something that was truly mine. The kitchen became my workplace and my refuge. I didn't have much equipment then. Just a couple of dented pans, a rolling pin, and a stove that worked better on some days than others. But I learned to make do. I learned to write out lists, to budget every ingredient, to time my cooking so nothing went to waste. Customers started asking for me by name, saying they liked the way my food tasted like home. Still, balancing it all wasn't easy. There were nights when my husband came home to find me covered in flour, the sink full of dishes, and he would shake his head. "You're running yourself ragged for nothing," he said more than once. But when I tucked my son into bed, when I heard him whisper to his friends that his mom made the best meals, it gave me the fuel to keep going. By the time he was in middle school, my catering had grown. I started taking bigger orders, Weddings, anniversaries, retirement parties. Each event was a risk. If something went wrong, it could ruin someone's special day. But most of the time, it didn't go wrong. In fact, it often went better than I expected. I remember one bride hugging me at the end of the night, tears in her eyes, saying my food had made her reception unforgettable. That moment was burned into me like a brand. Even then, I didn't dare dream too loudly about a restaurant. The idea seemed too big, too far from what people expected of me. But deep down, every plate I served, every smile I earned, built my confidence. I began to imagine what it might feel like to have a place of my own, with tables set each night, a menu written in my handwriting, and people coming not just for the food but for the comfort that came with it. Looking back, I realized those were the years that shaped me. I learned resilience not in some dramatic way, but in the everyday grind of carrying groceries up the stairs, staying awake long enough to prep for the next morning, and finding joy in the little victories. Every cake that rose properly, every stew that sold out, reminded me that I was capable of more than others believed. What stings now, after that phone call from my son, is knowing how much of that effort was for him. I thought I was building not just a career, but a safety net for his future. I wanted him to grow up seeing his mother as someone who never gave up, who found a way even when doors were closed. I didn't want him to feel the smallness I felt as a child, being told to keep my dreams realistic. But that night, as I sat there remembering it all, the irony struck me. My son, the very person for whom I had sacrificed sleep, comfort, and dignity, was the one who now dismissed me as an embarrassment. The hurt deepened when I thought of my daughter-in-law. She hadn't seen those early mornings, hadn't tasted the meals I made when there was almost nothing in the pantry, hadn't walked beside me carrying heavy trays into church basements. She only saw me as someone outdated, someone to be hidden. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the counter, staring at my reflection in the darkened kitchen window. It was strange to see how time had etched itself across my face. I could almost see the younger version of me standing there too, apron dusted with flour, eyes tired but determined. That woman had been brave enough to start with nothing. I reminded myself that she was still here, inside me, waiting for her chance again. The past has a way of creeping in when you least expect it. That night, as I thought back to where it all began, I realized I wasn't just remembering, I was being reminded. Reminded that I had built a life out of scraps before, and that I might have to do it again, this time not for anyone else's approval but for my own. Thinking back on those early catering years, what stands out most isn't the food itself, but the sacrifices stitched into every decision I made. None of it came easy. To make something work, I had to give up parts of myself, sometimes in ways that left marks no one else could see. Money was always tight. I remember nights when I skipped dinner so my son could have a second helping. I'd tell him I had already eaten, just to make sure he didn't notice. It wasn't that I was starving, but every saved portion mattered. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that one day I would build something solid enough to stop choosing who got what. Clothing was another trade-off. My son never went to school without a proper coat, but that often meant I wore the same winter jacket year after year. I'd patch it up quietly, keeping the stitching neat so he wouldn't notice. He deserved to walk into his classroom looking like he belonged. If that meant I looked worn, so be it. The hardest sacrifice was time. Catering jobs often stretched late into the night. I'd come home with my feet aching, hands raw from hours of chopping and scrubbing, and still force myself to check his homework. I didn't want him to think my work mattered more than he did. Sometimes I'd nod off beside him at the table, pen still in hand, before dragging myself back up to wash dishes that couldn't wait until morning. He never complained. In fact, when he was younger, he'd sometimes help carry groceries or stir a pot while I rushed around the kitchen. He thought it was fun, an adventure. I never told him it was survival. To him, it was play. To me, it was pressure. There were moments when I felt resentment creep in, though I hated admitting it even to myself. Other families seemed to move through life without constant calculation. Vacations, new furniture, evenings free to rest. For us, every dollar was stretched, every decision measured. My husband didn't see the hours I poured in as an investment. He saw them as unnecessary effort. "Why exhaust yourself like this?" he'd say. But I couldn't stop. I kept thinking about the future, my son's future, and how every bit I gave now might shield him from the struggles I had known. One evening stands out more than others. A storm had knocked out the bus schedule, and I had to walk nearly 2 miles home after a long catering shift. Rain soaked through my shoes, and the bag I carried felt heavier with every step. By the time I reached home, I was shivering, clothes clinging to me. My husband was asleep, but my son woke up when I opened the door. He saw me dripping wet, and his little voice asked, "Mom, are you okay?" I forced a smile and said I was fine. What I didn't tell him was that earlier that day, I had finally paid off the first part of his college savings plan. That memory, more than the wet shoes or aching muscles, is what stayed with me. Sacrifice became the rhythm of our home. I gave up dinners with friends, sold pieces of jewelry, and skipped outings so he could go on school trips. If he wanted to play the trumpet, I found a way. If he needed books, I cut corners elsewhere. He never knew the details because I wanted him to feel secure, to believe his world was stable even when mine was spinning. I also gave up something less visible, my own voice. I didn't speak much about what I wanted. I let my husband's skepticism linger in the air without challenge because I didn't want to argue in front of my son. I pushed down my own exhaustion because I didn't want him to see me weak. Looking back now, maybe I should have let him see more of the truth. Maybe he would have understood that strength doesn't always look tidy. There were small victories tucked inside the grind. Watching him walk across the stage at his 8th grade graduation, I felt pride heavier than any burden I had carried. When he made the honor roll, I stayed up late baking him a cake, even though I had orders due the next morning. Each time he achieved something, I told myself the sacrifices were worth it. But sacrifices leave scars. My health suffered. I ignored back pain, brushed off fatigue, and kept pushing forward. Doctors warned me to slow down, but slowing down meant letting bills pile up or turning down work. I couldn't afford that, not when every choice tied back to my son's future. As he grew older, I thought he might notice the pattern. I imagined he'd look back one day and realize what it had cost me to keep him steady. But as years passed, I saw how invisible those sacrifices had become. He accepted the opportunities one gave him, but he didn't always connect them to the things I had surrendered along the way. That's the bitter truth about giving up parts of yourself for someone else. If you do it quietly, they may never know it happened at all. That night after the phone call, sitting alone with my thoughts, I replayed it all. Every skipped meal, every worn-out coat, every silent tear hidden behind a kitchen door. They weren't dramatic gestures. They were daily choices, each one small on its own, but together they built the very life he lived. And now, to hear him tell me I embarrassed his wife, as though I had done nothing but stand in his way, that was the deepest cut of all. After years of stretching myself thin between catering jobs, home responsibilities, and my son's needs, there came a point when I knew I couldn't keep working out of my kitchen forever. The requests were getting bigger, the orders more complex, and the limits of a small stove and one refrigerator were showing. I had spent so long making do with scraps of time and resources that I almost didn't recognize when the opportunity to grow appeared. It started with a conversation at a wedding I catered. The groom's uncle owned a small property in town, a rundown space that had been a diner years before. The walls were chipped, the floors scuffed, and most people saw it as too far gone. But when I stood in that empty building for the first time, I didn't see what it was. I saw what it could be. Tables filled with families, the sound of forks tapping plates, and the smell of bread baking in the oven. The practical side of me hesitated. Rent wasn't cheap, and I barely had enough savings to cover the basics. My husband rolled his eyes when I brought it up, saying it would sink us. "Stick to catering," he warned. "It's safer." But I couldn't shake the image of that space alive with people. For the first time, I wanted to bet on myself. I applied for a small business loan. The process was humiliating at times. Bank officers asked me questions that made it clear they doubted me. They saw an older woman with no fancy degree and no partner backing her plan. More than once, I left their offices fighting back tears. But I kept going, filling out forms, gathering every letter of reference from clients who praised my food, and explaining over and over how I planned to make it work. The day I got approved, I sat in my car gripping the letter, unable to move. Relief and fear hit me all at once. I knew this was only the beginning, and the hardest work still lay ahead. Renovating the building nearly broke me. I scrubbed floors myself, scraped paint off windows, and bargained with local workers to stretch every dollar. I learned how to do things I never thought I'd need: fixing pipes, sanding wood, replacing tiles. On days when no one else showed up, I worked alone with a radio playing in the background, my hands raw but my mind set. My son, still in school, sometimes stopped by to watch. He didn't say much, but I hoped he felt some pride seeing his mother transform a forgotten building into something new. When the kitchen equipment finally arrived, a second-hand oven, battered but reliable, and a row of mismatched pots and pans, I felt like I had stepped into a dream. I stayed up late organizing everything, testing recipes, and imagining how each plate would look leaving the kitchen. Opening night was a blur. Only 12 customers came. Some were friends, others were curious locals. I moved between the kitchen and the dining area, nerves pulling at me, afraid something would go wrong. But the plates came back clean, the smiles genuine, and a few customers promised they would return. That was enough for me. The weeks that followed were brutal. There were nights when no one walked through the door. I'd sit at a table after closing, counting crumpled bills, wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. But then, little by little, word spread. A family told their neighbors. A church group came after Sunday service. A couple celebrated their anniversary in a corner booth. Slowly, the restaurant began to breathe. It wasn't glamorous. I washed dishes when staff didn't show up, ran to the market myself when supplies ran low, and fell asleep in the office chair more times than I could count. My hands bore the marks of burns and cuts, but they also held the proof of every meal I sent out. I had built this place with sweat, determination, and the stubborn refusal to quit. There were moments that made it all worthwhile. A little girl once hugged me after eating my chicken stew, saying it tasted like her grandmother's. An elderly man came every Friday for pie, calling it the highlight of his week. These small connections reminded me why I had started, not just to cook, but to create a space where people felt at home. I tried to share these moments with my family. My husband never came around to the idea. He thought I was wasting energy, though he appreciated the money when business improved. My son was more complicated. At first, he seemed proud. He'd bring friends to show off the restaurant, telling them, "My mom owns this place." But as he got older, that pride dimmed. He stopped mentioning it, almost as if he didn't want people to know. I didn't push him to explain. I thought he'd come around in his own time. Looking back, I see how blind I was. I thought the restaurant would be the bridge between us, something solid he could stand on. Instead, it became the silent wedge, something he resented more than respected. At the time, though, all I saw was progress. Customers filling tables, steady income, and the knowledge that I had finally taken a dream others dismissed and made it real. The restaurant was never just a business to me. It was proof that sacrifice wasn't wasted, that the years of patching coats, skipping meals, and walking home in the rain had led somewhere. Every chair, every plate, every corner of that building carried a piece of me. That's why, years later, when I saw the sign still standing, glowing in the night, it wasn't just a memory. It was a reminder that I hadn't lost everything. As the restaurant grew steadier, I thought the hardest part of my life was finally behind me. The bills were covered, the tables stayed full most nights, and for the first time, I allowed myself to breathe without worrying that everything might collapse. But success in business didn't heal what was happening at home, and it didn't fix the slow unraveling between me and my son. At first, he seemed proud of what I had built. He would bring his friends to eat, pointing out the walls I had painted, telling them how I had started with nothing. I remember one evening when he was about 16, sitting with a group of classmates in the corner booth, grinning as he bragged that his mom owned the place. My heart swelled, believing this was the start of something stronger between us. But as the years passed, that pride shifted into something else. He stopped bringing people, stopped even mentioning the restaurant. When I asked about it, he shrugged and said his friends weren't interested in old-fashioned cooking. I laughed it off at the time, but the words sank deeper than I let on. To him, what I poured my soul into wasn't worth talking about anymore. The change became clearer once he married. His wife was polite at first, always smiling, always thanking me when I hosted them for dinner. But the small remarks began to surface, so subtle at first that I questioned whether I was imagining them. "This food is heavy," she said once, setting down her fork after a few bites of stew. Another time, she teased, "You know, we don't really cook like this anymore. We try to keep things modern." I nodded, even smiled, but inside I felt a sting each time. Food wasn't just food to me. It was history, effort, and love. To dismiss it as outdated felt like dismissing me. I noticed how she preferred ordering takeout when they hosted gatherings at their house. Pizza boxes, sushi trays, anything but the meals I once thought brought families together. When I offered to bring something, she would pause before saying, "Oh, that's sweet, but don't trouble yourself." Those pauses told me everything. The wedge between us grew without any loud arguments, without any single breaking point. It was death by 1,000 cuts, quiet gestures that made it clear I was no longer welcome in the center of their lives. At holidays, my offers to host were brushed aside. At birthdays, my gifts were politely received but rarely mentioned again. When I called, it was often her voice that answered, short and distant, saying they were busy. One memory stays with me sharply. It was Thanksgiving, and I had cooked a full meal, expecting them to come. Hours before dinner, I got a call that they had accepted another invitation. My son's voice was calm, almost casual, as if it were no big deal. I sat at a table with enough food for 10 people and ate alone, listening to the ticking clock. That was when I realized how deeply the distance had set in. Over time, I adjusted. I told myself not to expect too much, not to take it personally. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about food or traditions. It was about the life I represented, the long nights, the patched jackets, the restaurant built with bare hands. None of that fit the image my son and his wife wanted for themselves. Still, I held on to hope. I told myself that families go through phases, that maybe with time, he would remember what I had given him. I never confronted them directly because I feared losing what little I still had. Silence felt safer than rejection. That silence became a habit. When she made jokes about my handwriting looking old, I stayed quiet. When she sighed at my stories about the past, I changed the subject. When they said they were busy, I smiled and said I understood. Each time, I folded myself a little smaller, hoping that being less would make me easier to keep around. But nothing changed. If anything, it grew worse. Invitations stopped coming altogether, replaced by quick phone calls that felt more like obligations than conversations. My son's tone grew clipped, as though I was intruding whenever I reached out. And then came that final phone call, the one that shattered the last illusion I had held onto. Sitting alone after he told me I embarrassed his wife, I finally understood that this wasn't sudden. It was years in the making, years of subtle dismissal building to one blunt rejection. The truth was, my daughter-in-law didn't want me around, and my son had chosen her comfort over my place in his life. What stung most was not the rejection itself, but the realization that my sacrifices had become invisible even to the person I had made them for. He didn't see the nights I walked home in the rain, the meals I skipped so he could eat, or the hours I poured into building a restaurant that could give him security. He saw only the version of me his wife didn't approve of. In that moment, I felt the sharp divide between what I had built and what I had lost. I owned a place that had become a part of the community, but I no longer owned a space in my son's world. It was a bitter truth, and one I wasn't ready to face fully. But as painful as it was, it planted the seed for what was coming next. After that phone call, I thought I would stay home and try to sleep, but the quiet inside my house felt unbearable. I couldn't sit still. Every room reminded me of how unwanted I had just been made to feel. The dress I had ironed hung loosely on my shoulders as if mocking me, and the meal I had prepared earlier sat untouched on the counter. So instead of forcing myself to stay in that silence, I grabbed my keys and stepped outside. The night air was cool, steady, and far calmer than the storm running through my chest. I told myself I was just going for a drive to clear my head, but part of me already knew where I was going. I didn't plan it, yet my hands on the steering wheel guided me without thought. Street after street blurred until I realized I was heading toward downtown. As I got closer, my eyes caught the glow of familiar lights. The sign was different now, updated and polished, but the building beneath it was the same one I had once scrubbed with my own hands. My restaurant. The place I had nearly lost everything for, but had somehow managed to keep alive. I pulled the car over across the street and stared at it. Cars were parked outside, voices carried from the patio, and the windows glowed with warmth. From where I sat, I could see shadows of people laughing over plates, just like I had imagined years ago when the floors were still bare and the walls still peeling. For a moment, I felt a pull stronger than my shame. I wanted to step inside, to remind myself I still belonged somewhere. Then I remembered. This was the very place my son and his wife had chosen to eat that night. They were inside, seated at a table, enjoying food without a thought about me sitting alone. The irony twisted inside me until I almost laughed. They had told me not to come to dinner because I embarrassed them, yet here they were dining in the restaurant that existed because of me. I sat in the car with the engine off, watching. My mind went back to the early mornings when I had unlocked that same front door, my hands stiff from the cold, determined to keep the place running. I remembered rolling dough in the back kitchen, my son still asleep at home, believing one day he would be proud of what I was building. And now he sat just beyond those windows, pretending none of it mattered. The longer I sat there, the heavier the thought became. I still owned it. The management had changed over the years, new staff had come in, the decor was updated, but legally it was still mine. I had never sold it outright. I had leased the operations, but my name had remained tied to it. My son didn't know. My daughter-in-law certainly didn't know. But every chair, every plate, every light glowing in that building was part of the foundation I had laid years ago. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, torn between two instincts. One told me to drive away, to let them enjoy their evening without knowing I was anywhere near. That part of me still carried the old habit of staying small, of folding myself to fit where I wasn't wanted. But another part, the part that had walked miles in the rain, the part that had fought for loans no one thought I could get, the part that had refused to give up on this restaurant, whispered that I had every right to be there. I thought of all the customers who had once thanked me, of the families who had celebrated milestones inside those walls, of the community that had grown around the meals I created. That place wasn't built out of embarrassment. It was built out of grit and sacrifice. If anyone had reason to sit proudly inside, it was me. I shut off the car and sat still for a long moment, gathering my breath. Through the window, I thought I caught a glimpse of my son's profile, his head tilted as he listened to his wife speak. My chest tightened, but not from shame. For the first time that night, I felt something else stir, the reminder that I had a story he had forgotten, one I needed to reclaim for myself. Finally, I opened the car door. My shoes touched the pavement, and the sound felt louder than it should have, like a step into something I couldn't take back. I crossed the street slowly, each step pulling me closer to the building that had been mine for so many years. The closer I got, the steadier my resolve grew. I wasn't walking into their dinner. I was walking back into my place. When I reached the entrance, I paused, hand on the door handle. For a second, doubt tried to creep in again. What if they turned and looked at me with the same disdain my son's voice had carried on the phone? What if the staff had changed so much they no longer remembered who I was? I almost turned back. But then I reminded myself, this building carried my name, my effort, and my years. Whether anyone acknowledged it or not, the truth didn't change. I pulled the door open. The hum of conversation, the smell of fresh food, and the warmth of the room washed over me at once. The staff behind the counter glanced up, and recognition flickered in their eyes. A young manager smiled, coming forward quickly, and said words I hadn't expected to hear, but desperately needed. "It's so good to see you back, Mrs. I exhaled, steadying myself. At that moment, I knew I had made the right choice. Walking into the restaurant, I expected to feel like a stranger, but the opposite happened. The manager's smile steadied me, and when he called me by name, something inside me settled. I wasn't invisible here. I wasn't a guest who needed permission to belong. I was the woman who had poured herself into every corner of this place, and the staff hadn't forgotten. He guided me toward the bar and asked if I wanted a table. My instinct was to refuse, to say I had only stopped in for a moment. But then I saw it, framed photographs still hanging on the back wall. There was one of the opening nights, with me standing proudly in front of a small crowd. My apron was stained, my hair pulled back in a hurry, but my smile was wide. That picture, though faded, hadn't been removed. I felt my throat tighten, not from shame but from recognition. This was still mine. Not just in memory, not just in spirit, but in fact. When I leaned toward the manager and asked quietly if my name was still on the ownership papers, he nodded without hesitation. Yes, he said. Nothing has ever changed. The restaurant may be under different management now, but the foundation is still yours. Those words landed heavier than I could process. All the doubts that had gnawed at me in the car, all the feelings of being unwanted and erased, began to crack. The very place my son and his wife had chosen for their evening was tied to me in a way they couldn't undo. They thought they were escaping me, yet they had walked right into my creation. I sat down at a small table near the kitchen doors, still taking it all in. Staff members passed by with plates, and a few nodded politely, recognizing me even if they didn't know every detail. One waitress leaned close and whispered, "We still use your stew recipe on Thursdays. Customers ask for it." My chest tightened again, but this time with something close to relief. I had been dismissed at home, but here, my work was still alive, still respected. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them. My son and his wife were seated across the room, laughing with another couple. Their table was covered with dishes I recognized, meals I was born in the kitchen I had once run with my own hands. They didn't see me at first. The angle of my table gave me a few moments to observe. He looked comfortable, almost carefree. She looked elegant, her gestures deliberate, the picture of confidence. Watching them, I realized they had no idea I was only a few steps away. For a moment, I considered leaving quietly, holding on to the satisfaction of simply knowing the truth. But something inside me, something I hadn't felt in years, began to rise. This wasn't about interrupting their evening. It was about reminding myself of what was real. My son had told me I embarrassed his wife, but the evidence around us showed otherwise. I was not an embarrassment. I was the foundation. The manager returned and asked if I wanted to order. I opened the menu, half expecting to find nothing of me left, but there it was. My handwriting wasn't on the pages anymore, but my dishes were. The chicken stew, the roast with rosemary, the pie that had once been my signature, all still there. Changed slightly, dressed up with fancier descriptions, but still mine at the core. I pointed to one of them and ordered, my voice steady. As I waited, memories flooded me. Long nights perfecting the recipes, the frustration of batches that didn't turn out, the joy when customers asked for seconds. Every bite served tonight traced back to those years of trial and persistence. My daughter-in-law might laugh at my cooking, call it heavy or outdated, but these meals were what kept people coming back, what had turned a run-down building into a thriving business. When my plate arrived, I lifted the fork slowly, almost afraid of what it would feel like. But the first taste silenced every doubt. It was the same. Different chef, different presentation, but the essence was mine. At that moment, I didn't feel like an outsider watching from a distance. I felt like the heart of the room. Across the dining area, my son finally looked up. His eyes scanned the room, and then he saw me. His smile faltered. His wife followed his gaze, and her expression shifted in an instant, surprise first, then something closer to discomfort. She leaned in, whispering something I couldn't hear. My son's face tightened, but he didn't look away. I didn't raise my voice, didn't call out. I simply held his gaze for a moment, steady and calm, before returning to my meal. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself. I didn't need to prove my worth. The truth was already here, in the walls, in the food, in the respect from strangers who still remembered me. I realized then that this was the turning point. I didn't need to fight for their approval. I didn't need to shrink myself to fit into the narrow space they allowed me. I owned the building they were dining in. I owned the recipes they were eating. And more importantly, I owned my story. As I finished my meal, the staff checked on me with quiet respect, not rushing me, not treating me like a forgotten figure. When the manager brought the bill, he smiled and said, "You don't pay here. You never have to." I thanked him, not because I expected anything less, but because the gesture confirmed what I had already begun to accept. I was still recognized, still valued. I stood and glanced once more at my son. His wife had turned away, busying herself with her wine glass, but he kept looking at me. He didn't speak, and I didn't either. Some moments don't need words. The weight of silence said enough. When I walked out of the restaurant, the cool night air met me again. This time, I didn't feel small or unwanted. I felt anchored. Whatever came next, I had already reclaimed something I thought was gone. I could have left that night with only the quiet satisfaction of knowing my presence alone was enough, but something inside me told me it wasn't finished. Sitting silently across the room had given me strength, but walking away without facing them directly would have kept part of me hidden. I had hidden long enough. So I stood, steadying myself, and walked across the dining area toward their table. The room wasn't silent, but I felt the shift in energy as eyes followed me. My son noticed first. His shoulders tensed, his fork paused midair, and his wife's head turned sharply. Her expression tightened, not in surprise this time, but in irritation that I had crossed an invisible line she thought she controlled. When I reached their table, I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at my son and said, "Good evening. I see you chose a fine place for dinner." The words were plain, but the meaning was clear. His wife set her glass down slowly, her fingers tight around the stem, and said, "We didn't expect to see you here." I leaned slightly toward the table, calm and steady. "That's because you didn't know this is mine." The words weren't shouted, just spoken firmly. The couple sitting with them looked startled, glancing from me to my son, unsure of what to say. My son's face shifted, his jaw working as if he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the right words. His wife recovered first. "Yours? That can't be true. We come here all the time, and no one ever mentioned that." Her voice was sharp, but there was a flicker of doubt. I gestured lightly toward the staff standing nearby. "Ask them. They know who I am. I built this place, and while I let others run it, the foundation remains mine." The manager who had greeted me earlier appeared at my side, almost as if on cue, and said clearly, "She's right. This restaurant still belongs to her." The weight of his confirmation silenced the table. My son's wife leaned back in her chair, her lips pressed into a thin line. I turned my attention back to my son. "You told me not to come to dinner because I embarrassed her. But here you sit, enjoying food that came from the very hands you tried to dismiss. Do you see the contradiction?" My voice wasn't angry, but the steadiness in it made the truth sharper than shouting could have. His eyes dropped for a moment before he looked back at me. I didn't think you'd ever be here." "I didn't mean," he stopped, unable to finish. His wife cut in, defensive. "Well, if you really own this place, why didn't you say so before? Why keep it a secret?" I straightened my shoulders. Because my worth was never meant to be a weapon, or something to be thrown in your face. I thought love was enough. I thought respect would come naturally. But when respect is denied, the truth has to stand on its own. The couple they were dining with shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. My son's hands rested on the table, fingers curling and uncurling. He finally said, "Mom, this isn't the place for this conversation." I shook my head. "No, this is exactly the place. You tried to cut me out of your world, yet you walked right into mine. You told me I embarrassed your wife, but tonight it is clear I was never the embarrassment. I was the one who made the very ground you're sitting on possible." The table grew quiet. His wife stared at me, anger flashing in her eyes, but she didn't argue again. She couldn't. The facts sat heavier than her pride. My son glanced at her, then back at me, his face pale. I didn't need him to admit anything out loud. The silence told me enough. I placed my hand on the edge of their table, not to lean but to study the words that followed. "I'm not here to fight. I'm not here to beg for a seat. I came tonight because I needed to remind myself that I am not invisible, and I am not disposable. You don't have to welcome me in your home if you choose not to. But you cannot erase me, no matter how hard you try. I stepped back then, letting the words hang. My son's eyes followed me, searching, maybe even softening, but I didn't wait for his response. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about me reclaiming my place. As I walked away from their table, the staff greeted me with nods and smiles, small gestures that reminded me I wasn't standing alone. The weight that had pressed on me since the phone call began to lift. For the first time in years, I had spoken without shrinking. When I sat back at my own table, my plate was cleared away, but the space felt full. I didn't need to finish a meal to feel satisfied. I had already claimed what I came for. Walking back to my own table, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. For so long, I had swallowed my pride, convinced myself that silence was easier than confrontation. But now that the words had finally been spoken, I realized how heavy the weight of silence had truly been. I hadn't embarrassed anyone. The only thing I had done was remind them of what they had tried to forget. The restaurant buzzed around me. Plates clattered, glasses clinked, conversations rose and fell. No one seemed unsettled by what had just happened except the two people who had dismissed me. I had expected more of a scene, maybe whispers, maybe stares, but the truth was simple. I belonged here, and everyone knew it. My son still hadn't moved. From where I sat, I could see him glancing in my direction, his shoulders tight, his face unreadable. His wife leaned toward him, her lips close to his ear, speaking quickly, her eyes flashing with something between anger and discomfort. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he sat with his hands folded on the table, staring down, lost in thought. I leaned back in my chair and let the moment stretch. For the first time, I wasn't waiting on his approval. I wasn't hoping for an apology. The reversal was already here, not because he admitted anything, but because I no longer needed him to. The manager came over quietly and asked if everything was all right. I nodded and thanked him. "You've kept this place alive," I said. He smiled, replying, "We've only continued what you started." His words settled in me like a final confirmation. My son and his wife could turn their faces away, but they couldn't take away the reality. I had built something that endured, something larger than their opinions. I thought back to the years of sacrifice, the rain-soaked walks home, the patched jackets, the skipped meals. Each choice had led to this moment, to these walls, to the tables filled with families who would never know my name, but were touched by my work all the same. That was my legacy, and no dismissal from my own child could erase it. After a while, my son rose from his chair. He hesitated, glancing back at his wife, then walked slowly toward me. His steps were uncertain, his hands shoved into his pockets the way he used to stand as a boy when he felt guilty. He stopped beside my table and cleared his throat. "Mom," he said quietly, "I didn't know. I didn't realize you still owned it." His voice trailed off, thin, unsure. I met his eyes. "That's because you never asked. You stopped wanting to hear my story a long time ago." He shifted uncomfortably. "She didn't mean it like that, about being embarrassed. She gets nervous around you." "You remind her," he paused, searching for words. "I remind her of what?" I asked, steady but calm. His gaze fell. "Of everything she can't control." The honesty in his tone surprised me. For a brief second, I almost softened. But then I remembered every moment I had been silenced, every gathering I had been excluded from, every time I was told I didn't belong. I leaned forward slightly. "Your wife may find me inconvenient, but she will not erase me. And if you choose to stand with her in that, then you're the one who loses, not me." He opened his mouth, then shut it again. I could see the conflict in his face, torn between loyalty to his wife and the recognition of the truth I had spoken. He nodded once, faintly, before stepping back. When he returned to his table, his wife's face was stiff, her jaw tight. She didn't look at me again. But my son's expression had changed. He didn't laugh with the others. He didn't pick up his fork. He sat quietly, glancing over now and then, as though the weight of what had just passed between us wouldn't leave him alone. I didn't need more. The reversal wasn't about making them admit anything. It was about standing in my own strength, refusing to shrink. The woman who had once carried groceries through the rain, who had patched jackets in secret, who had built a restaurant from nothing, that woman was no longer hiding in the background. I motioned for the bill, though the manager reminded me I never had to pay. I insisted anyway, pressing the notes into his hand. "This is for me," I said. "Because tonight isn't about owing or being owed. It's about claiming what's mine." As I gathered my things, I felt a lightness that had nothing to do with the meal. For years, I had feared being seen as small, as outdated, as an embarrassment. But standing there in the restaurant I created, looking across the room at the son who had tried to push me aside, I knew the truth was the opposite. I wasn't small. I wasn't outdated. I wasn't erased. I walked out without waiting for another glance from their table. The night air met me again, cool against my face. This time, I didn't feel alone. I felt whole. So, let's get into what happened after I stepped out of the restaurant, because leaving that building wasn't the end of the night, it was the beginning of something new for me. I stood on the sidewalk, the glow from the windows still spilling across the pavement, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was on the outside looking in. I didn't rush to the car. I didn't feel the urge to cry. Instead, I took a slow breath and allowed myself to feel the steady ground under my feet. I walked toward the corner and stopped, looking back at the sign. My name wasn't written anywhere on it for others to see, but I knew the truth, and that was enough. Ownership didn't always need a title on the wall or a loud announcement. Sometimes it was knowing deep inside that you had created something no one could take away. I decided not to drive home immediately. Instead, I turned down a nearby street and found a small cafe still open. I stepped inside, ordered tea, and sat by the window. The space was quiet, with only a handful of customers. For once, I didn't mind being alone. It felt different from the silence of my kitchen earlier that night. This silence carried freedom, not rejection. As I stirred the cup in front of me, I thought about the years that had led here. Every choice I made, every sacrifice, every hard day at the restaurant had prepared me for this moment. Not because I had planned for this confrontation, but because building that place had built me. The restaurant was part of my history, but more than that, it was proof of my resilience. I realized then that I had spent too much of my life tying my worth to whether or not my son accepted me. I had measured my value in how welcomed I felt at his table. Tonight showed me I had been measuring in the wrong place. My worth had never depended on his approval. It had been in front of me all along, in the walls I painted, the recipes I created, the lives I touched through my food. Finishing my tea, I left the cafe and drove home, but the heaviness that usually greeted me at the door was gone. The dress I had ironed earlier still hung on me, wrinkled now, but I didn't see it as wasted effort anymore. That dress wasn't a sign of rejection, it was proof I had been ready to show up, even when others turned me away. When I walked into the kitchen, the meal I had cooked earlier still sat on the counter. I didn't throw it out. I heated a plate for myself, sat down at the table, and ate in peace. The food tasted different than it had hours before. It wasn't flavored with expectation or the hope of pleasing anyone else. It was simply nourishment, and it was mine. As I cleared the dishes, I thought about what would come next. I didn't expect sudden change. My son might not call for a while. His wife might never look at me with respect. But that no longer defined me. What mattered was that I had reclaimed the part of myself I had hidden for too long. I went to bed that night not with sadness, but with a quiet sense of closure. I had faced the very people who tried to shrink me, and I hadn't lowered my eyes. I had spoken clearly, lived truthfully, and left without waiting for validation. That was enough. The next morning, sunlight filled the kitchen as I brewed coffee. I opened my old recipe book, the one with notes scribbled in the margins, and flipped through its pages. For years, I had closed it whenever I felt unseen, almost ashamed of its stains and worn cover. But now, I see it differently. It wasn't outdated or embarrassing. It was a record of my life, each page tied to a moment of persistence. I decided I would begin cooking again, not for my son, not to prove anything to anyone, but for myself and for the people who still appreciated what I had to give. Whether it was staff at the restaurant, neighbors who remembered my dishes, or even strangers who might come to taste something familiar, I would keep sharing the food that carried my history. That night at the restaurant didn't end with applause or a dramatic reconciliation. It ended with me understanding something essential. I didn't need their approval to live fully. The reversal wasn't about forcing my son or his wife to see me differently. It was about me seeing myself clearly for the first time in years. I had been told I was an embarrassment, but I walked out knowing the opposite was true. I was the foundation, the story, the work that endured. And while they might never admit it, they couldn't erase what I had built. When I closed my eyes that evening, I felt no bitterness. Only peace. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't loud or public. Sometimes it's sitting in your own kitchen, eating the meal you made with your own hands, knowing you have already won. He told me I embarrassed his wife, yet he sat eating in the very restaurant I built with my own hands. That night, I walked away not as someone excluded, but as someone who had finally reclaimed her place. And stories like mine aren't rare. Too often, women who give everything are treated as if they no longer matter. But what happens when one of those women, tucked away in a retirement home's quiet corner, refuses to fade and instead organizes a movement that changes everything? That's where you need to go next. Trust me, you'll want to see it.